Gray thought that he had no belief in the phenomenon of light at the end of a tunnel, a concept widely known among people. It made them feel like they were close to death, seeing a light with cold sweat rolling down the sides of their faces. However, at present, he still felt like he was in a tunnel. He wondered how he could die like that, and the only thing he remembered was being alone in his room, gazing at the city. Suddenly his body felt heavy, so he laid on his bed. He pondered whether he had been poisoned or assassinated, considering the numerous threats against his life as a king. He concluded that there was nothing more he could do for his impending death but to accept it. He hoped there wouldn't be a chorus of angelic babies with wings singing at his demise. As the light approached him, he was reborn in a new place. Someone congratulated his parents because the baby that arrived was healthy. Gray questioned whether he had been born. His father urged his mother to hold on because he couldn't see anything. Gray gets that the light seemed to come from a woman, though he considered it unimportant. His mother complimented him, saying he was so cute. His father noted that Art had his mother's hair. Art wondered where he was and realized he couldn't understand their language, which he considered a positive sign. His mother continued, pointing out that Art had his father's eyes. Observing his father, Art thought he would be strict. As his father extended his hands towards Art, revealing himself as Art's father, he asked if Art could say Dada. His mother replied that Art had just been born. Art surveyed his surroundings, finding them to be normal. He noticed hand pads, a helmet, and other items, wondering where he was. His mother gently took him in her hands. They resided in a hut, and weeks passed slowly. Art's mother, a lively and kind-hearted woman, tightly held the reins in their family. His father, Reynolds, was a dependable and charismatic man, setting aside his childish activities. It was fortunate that Art was born into a lovely environment, unlike his past life filled with the constant scrutiny of enemies and limited control over his limbs, imprisoned in the constraints of his own body. The arrival of Alice seemed to cleanse away all those challenges. Art reflected on the mental fortitude he had developed as a king over the years, holding on to the fading hope that it might all be a dream, the only thing keeping him sane. Alice lifted Art onto her shoulder, and they headed to the market. Art felt as if he had been born into a more distant past, resembling an archaic period. As they strolled, Art observed a person wielding a sword in a knight's suit, prompting him to wonder if people in the past commonly carried weapons. He also noticed vials of suspicious-looking liquids being passed around, questioning whether they were medicinal products legally sold. Alice noticed that Art seemed tired and suggested they head back home. Once they arrived, she placed him in the swing. Art, believing that knowledge was strength, confidently assessed his surroundings over the past week, thinking he had a firm grasp on what to expect. Suddenly Reynolds appeared and, lifting Art, asked what he was up to. In a playful manner, he tossed Art into the air. Alice, alarmed, inquired about the potential consequences if Art were dropped. Despite Art not feeling well, Reynolds insisted that he used to enjoy such play as a child and believed Art was having fun too. He spun Art in the air, leading to a moment of discomfort. However, Art's leg hit something, prompting Alice to intervene by placing her hand on Reynolds' shoulder, stopping the play and expressing concern. Art began crying, but Alice quickly applied something to his leg, assuring him it was all better. She then picked him up, and Art contemplated that he might start speaking soon, though he still knew little about this new world. Art found himself reminiscing about his past life as a king, leading armies and engaging in duels with representatives from various countries. Despite his accomplishments in that life, he realized he had never felt as proud as he did now as a young boy. As he reached the stage where he could crawl, Alice reminded Reynolds to ensure that Art didn't hit any corners. Reynolds instructed her to block Art from approaching the shelf. In the midst of their efforts, Art accidentally bumped into a mirror, catching sight of himself for the first time in this new world. His parents were overjoyed to see him looking at his reflection. Despite several months passing, he still didn't have a new name, but he couldn't deny that, as a king, the name Art suited him perfectly. He playfully warned future girls to be prepared for heartbreak, and his parents joined in the laughter. Later, as his mother made him sleepy and kissed his cheeks before leaving, Art couldn't help but appreciate the joy and laughter that filled his new life. As she stepped outside, Art woke up and decided it was time to embark on his mission. Struggling to free himself from the swing, he speculated that Alice believed he was still asleep. Art estimated he had about an hour before she would come to check on him. Crawling cautiously, he emerged from the swing and observed Alice engrossed in singing while cleaning utensils, oblivious to his movements. With determination, Art swiftly headed towards the study room. Upon entering, he discovered it was empty except for the books, bringing him a sense of joy. Ever since he found this secluded place, he had contemplated sneaking in every night to learn more about the new world. Art began delving into the books, uncovering information about the Dictathan continent and its composition of 3 major kingdoms. The first kingdom was Elenoir, an elven realm deep within the forest. The second was Darv, an underground kingdom inhabited by dwarves. The third was Sapin, the most populated region, where humans resided. Art pondered the similarities between the new world's monarch system and his old world's, noting that rulership in this world was more inherited than earned. As he perused a book, he realized that the knowledge he had initially discovered in this world was significantly less developed compared to his previous life. However, Art grasped the main reason for the lack of technological advancement in the new world. It was the presence of magic. Opening a book, he resumed reading from where he had left off last time. He recalled that in his past life, there was a life force called Ki, utilized by practitioners to strengthen their bodies and weapons through rigorous training. Similarly, the new world had mana, unlike Ki, which existed only within a person. Mana permeated the entire world. The control of mana was largely genetic, with only 1 out of 100 children possessing it, and it could be utilized in various ways. 2 common practices were augmenting and conjuring. Augmenting involved enhancing the body with mana, providing incredible strength, defense, and agility, but it had the limitation of a restricted range. Conjurers emitted mana into the outside world, allowing them to manipulate their surroundings with their thoughts. Some supplemented their mana core by drawing mana from the external environment to cast spells. Art learned that Alice was a deviant and an emitter. There was also a rare type of mage capable of casting unique restorative mana. According to the book, mages typically awakened between early adolescence and late teenage years when their mana core manifested. Art recognized the mana core's similarity to the Ki center from his past world. In his past world, children were taught to meditate to form the Ki center, sensing fragments of Ki within their bodies and gathering them into a single place. Art attempted this practice and found it effective. However, his concentration was interrupted when Alice suddenly lifted him up, expressing concern that he had made her worry. Upon examining his face, she amusingly inquired if he was having difficulty with a bowel movement. Art, determined to embark on his journey to become the greatest mage in this new world, insisted that he wasn't an infant struggling with constipation. Despite Alice's reassurance that it seemed like he had no trouble, she remarked that it was time to change his diaper. Art, playfully trying to divert attention, jokingly thought that he had turned his diaper into a spiked one. Alice found herself sitting alone in a room with a diary on the table. As she began jotting down her thoughts, she reflected on the fact that 2 years had passed, and each day she discovered new things about Art. She reached a conclusion that he must be the most adorable baby in the world, with his little patch of auburn hair and azure eyes that seemed to gaze almost intelligently at her. Realizing that she had to be a strict and dependable mother, she couldn't rely on Reynold. She recalled an incident where, While going to wash the clothes, she discovered Reynold training Art to attack with a stick. Shocked and angered, she vividly remembered the moment when Art and Reynold looked scared as she caught them. In her diary, she documented the incident, expressing her concern over Reynold teaching Art to fight, especially when he could only crawl. She reminisced about the times when she took Art to the market, especially the small merchant strip that always caught his attention. While they went shopping for groceries once or twice a week, Art was particularly happy to observe someone using magic there. Alice justified this by considering it as not spoiling him but providing fresh food and educational experiences. She often wondered how he would be in his older age. Regarding Reynold, she had no doubt that he would be interested in becoming an adventurer, but Alice couldn't help but hope that he would fare better than the naive young teens, aspiring to make it big in the adventurous world. Torn between her concerns and hopes for Art's future, she contemplated moving his crib into the study to curb his persistent habit of sneaking in there. After making that decision, Alice stopped writing in her diary. Once, Art observed his father practicing outside the window. 2 years had passed since Art began his journey of study, and he found the daily learning process to be fascinating. While looking at his father, Art noticed him chanting something for a few minutes with intense concentration. To Art's surprise, his father managed to make a stone fly. Intrigued, Art wondered about the magic phenomenon Reynold was using. Reynold then increased his strength and exerted pressure, causing other rocks to levitate in the air. Art was shocked to witness this display of magical prowess by his father. As Reynold trained in the yard, Art watched him from the window. When Reynold noticed Art watching, he commented to Art that his father was awesome. However, Art didn't feel good about it and thought it was only 3 minutes of Reynold's concentration on throwing something he could physically handle with less effort. Alice arrived, moving her hand on Art's head, and asked him if he was watching his dad. She realized that Reynold had ruined the front yard again. Reynold put on gloves, and Art reflected that he had learned fairly early that his father was an augmenter. He wondered how Reynold would be when his mana cord awakened. As a tree leaf fell to the ground, Reynold started practicing fighting and kicking, putting in a lot of effort. Art smiled, but as he turned, he felt unwell at the height from which he was standing. He sat down and tried to get down on his own. Alice commented that half of Art's eyes were closed, suggesting he needed a nap. She picked him up and, by kissing him, took him away. Art asked for a book, but Alice denied, saying it was nap time. Art thought he didn't have any other choice, so he joined his hands in front of Alice and requested the books. His face lit up differently. With that, Alice agreed to let him stay in the study for a while. Stay tuned to watch that exciting story. As Alice agreed to let Art read the book, she thought that she wasn't a doting mother, but the child's age needed to play a lot, and she baby-proofed the room. Art thought that he wasn't demeaning and a great warrior must have utilized all weapons in his arsenal. She then kept looking at him, and just as she heard the sound of something getting crashed, she told Art that she would come soon and his father had better not have knocked down one more tree. Art saw her going outside and thought that his biggest accomplishment, aside from the accumulated knowledge of that world, was his progress in forming a many-mana core. He then got to meditate and thought that he had spent those 2 years moving tens of thousands of tiny fragments of mana inside his body and gathering them together near his solar plexus. And he could see why that would take until adolescence to form naturally, and seeing how slow those fragments gravitated towards the center of his body. As he was meditating, that was an arduous task both for his body and mind, but those 2 years weren't going to be wasted. And he was almost done with that. Outside, his father really broke one more tree, and his mother was laughing. As the both of the two white things got combined, a huge blast was made in his house. Reynold rushed to cover Alice. As Reynold covered Alice, the blast hit his back badly. He asked if she was fine. She replied that Art was still in the house. Upon hearing that, Reynolds rushed towards the house, and as he cleared his way to get inside, he was shocked to see something there and knelt down. As Alice arrived, she asked what happened there. Reynolds replied that it might be kidding, because Art wasn't yet 3 years old, but he was able to use magic by himself and was floating in the air. By using that, Art stayed safe, and as he came down and felt relaxed, he sensed the mana core around himself. He even saw the trees getting greener. As he realized he was looking at the trees, he looked around and was shocked to see the destruction there. He wondered if they were attacked and who would dare to attack the house of a king. After everything returned to normal, in the past year, his mother had been teaching him how to write and read. He was also learning the basics of mana manipulation and augmentation. Initially, his body was too small to sparkle, so he did basic body workouts with his father like running, curl-ups and push-ups. It wasn't too long ago when his father finally decided that he would be fine for practice. So, on his 3rd birthday, while he was reading a book alone, his father came and showed that he had brought a wooden sword for Art, saying, "Let's get to training." His father came in such a rush that some papers flew away and spread around. Reynolds took Art outside of the house and reminded him of what he had taught Art, instructing him to match the flow of mana with his breathing like his heart or lungs. His core was a different organ. Reynolds also had a wooden stick in his hand. Art wondered if a 4-year-old child would understand those instructions. After that, he practiced with his sword by striking it with the stick held by his father. After a lot of slashing, Reynolds encouraged Art that he could do it. Art thought that Reynolds was not going to let him rest until he did it, and he only had a few moments to study before dinner. He concentrated, and as he slashed, Reynolds' stick broke and fell at a distance. Then Art asked his father if he could study. As his father agreed, Art began to meditate and thought about how in that world, strength was measured by the color of one's mana core. They started off black due to the body's impurities mixing with mana particles to form the core. Over time, the core became more pure as impurities were filtered out, with the order going as follows: black, red, orange, yellow, silver, and white. Each stage had 3 shades: dark, light, and solid. The lighter the mana core, the purer and more powerful it was. Suddenly, Alice called him for dinner, distracting Art. As they all had dinner, Art wondered if a small child could get some free time to learn and how else he was supposed to learn. Alice suggested that it was time to hire a proper mentor for Art. Alive and Reynolds got into an argument on that topic. Alive argued that Art was only 4 years old, and besides, Reynolds had taken the responsibility to teach him. Reynolds replied that he never expected Art to be such a prodigy in mana manipulation at just 4 years old. He felt he was holding Art back, but Art had a lot of potential. Alive said she wasn't comfortable with her child leaving home to go to a city that was hundreds of miles away. Reynolds argued that Cyrus wasn't just any city, he had a friend there who would take good care of Art as well. After some heated arguments, they slammed their hands on the table, and Reynolds asked Art if he wanted to go to a big city to get a real teacher. Art thought they were asking too much of a 4-year-old to decide. He then asked if they couldn't come too and meet the teacher together. They both looked at each other. Art wondered if he had said something wrong and made things too complicated. But then his parents laughed, and his father said they hadn't really thought about all of them going together. Alive said she felt better about being there when Art was tested and met his teacher. Reynolds slammed the table and declared that it seemed like they were all going to Cyrus City. Art was shocked to overhear his parents already preparing for the 3-week journey. He then resumed reading the book and reached the page where he had left off. Just then, Alice came and took the book from Art, telling him that he needed to go to bed because they were heading to the city early the next morning. Art replied that it all seemed to be happening so fast. Alive mentioned that she hated rushing like that too, but their friends from the Twin Horns were also going to Cyrus, so they were taking them along, and Reynolds was currently with them. She then gave him a forehead kiss and, while leaving, suggested to him not to start reading again and to also bring some books with him on his trip, so for that time he had to sleep. He agreed, and then Alice greeted him and closed the door. Art thought that he knew the twin horns had been in the area for a while, and had even been helping to rebuild their home when they had the time. And from what he had heard, the party consisted of 2 conjurers and 3 augments. That would help with whatever troubles they might run into. He was finally moving on from that small, quiet town. That was the time to see what the world truly had to offer. The next morning they left their home, and while walking, they met Reynolds' friend. As Reynolds hugged him, he thanked his friend for taking them on the trip. Reynolds then invited them to meet his son, and then Art introduced himself. Art bowed and, while saying his name, he thanked the fellas for coming with them to Cyrus. Fellas moved his hand over Art and said that he had good manners, then asked Art if he was sure Reynolds was his father. Just then Rose, Fella's wife, lifted Art and hugged him, commenting that he was too precious and looked like her mother. Art wondered what was going on with him and found it hard to breathe. Durden told Rose that she was hurting him, then lifted Art in his hand. Durden was a giant man. He then placed Art on the ground. Art saw Jasmine sitting silently there, and as she stood and walked away, Helen came to Art. Art was still looking at Jasmine, and Helen told Art that he didn't have to mind her, as she just needed to get used to Art. Helen then introduced herself, extending her hand towards Art and commenting that it was nice to meet him. Durden announced to everyone that they should get acquainted and prepare to leave from there. They then loaded all the things into the carriage. Fellas asked if everything was fine at the back. Rose replied that they were all good. Fellas then suggested they get going. There were 2 carts from which they were departing. Art, looking back, thought that his journey had finally begun. As the journey progressed, night fell, and they encountered some monsters that they killed and brought back to the bonfire to cook for food. As they all sat around the fire, Helen asked Art if he was tired, but he reassured her that he didn't have to worry about that, as it was his first time traveling like this. Art replied that he guessed so and then stretched his hand. Helen mentioned to him that his father had been bragging nearly the entire way there, claiming he was a genius mage, and asked Art if he really awakened a year ago. They continued their conversation. Just then, Fellas stood up and told Reynolds that he was going to do some stretching before going to sleep. Reynolds had mentioned earlier that he had been sparring with Art, so he asked if Fellas minded joining in with Art. Art wondered if Fellas would stretch out by himself. Reynolds cautioned Fellas to be careful, as they had barely moved from light strength and the exercises could be intense. Fellas came over and lifted Art, taking him away from there. Art thought that normal kids his age could barely climb a flight of stairs, but he guessed no one thought it unusual to spar with him. Fellas took Art for a sword battle and asked if he was ready. Art stretched his hand and Fellas asked if he knew how to reinforce his weapon. Art let out a roar like a tiger. Looking at Reynolds, Art felt they were communicating telepathically as father and son. Art thought that Fellas seemed ready for a serious fight, so he tried to get out of that situation. However, Reynolds appeared to be encouraging Art to do his best. Art thought it was pointless and decided to use skills from his previous life. He ran and launched an attack on Fellas, who defended himself and pushed Art back. Art felt frustrated with his inexperienced body. Despite attempting to attack Fellas again and again, he kept getting dodged until finally, after some time, their swords clashed. Art thought that in that town, Newton's third law of motion applied in his mind, causing him to fall to the ground. Alice seemed worried about him. Art wondered if Fellas' opposite reaction had hurt. As Art stood up, Durden slapped the back of Fellas' head and commented that it was too hard for such a small kid. Fellas asked Reynolds if he hadn't taught that to Art and what kind of hellish training he had put him through to create such a little monster. Reynolds replied that he hadn't taught that to Art. Alice proceeded to heal Art and asked if that was what Art was studying. Art replied that he learned it by watching his father and reading books. Someone mentioned that Art was still going to teach them some of those movement techniques of his. 7 days had passed since they started their journey to the city of Isirus. One morning, they were bathing near a waterfall. Alice was washing Art, and Art thought about how his birthday had also passed during that time, reminding him of the birthday gifts and lessons he had received. They all continued their training with decent progress. While Fellas was in the river, Durden jumped into the water, but he accidentally slipped and, in doing so, created a pressure wave that caused a fish to land on Jasmine's head. Art was surprised to learn that Jasmine had already succeeded in learning some techniques. He marveled at how fast Jasmine was able to grasp his instructions, especially when learning the feint step. Just then, Art saw Reynold running with a bucket containing Draden and Fella's clothes. After all the fun, they got ready to leave. Alice called Art to get going. As he got into the carriage, they all departed from there. As they left after having fun at the waterfall, they stopped at a point to take a small break. Fellas came to Art and told an incident where Reynold had put them all in trouble. Just as they saw Helen sitting on top of the carriage, she replied that she was totally sure that Reynold wasn't the one by whom those things were caused, and that there wasn't a time when Fella's accident had set off. Just as Fellas tried to change the topic and said to not mind that, Art looked at his mother and asked if she was fine. She replied that she was a bit tired but would be fine. Just as Art opened the book and started reading, he couldn't concentrate because Jasmine was staring at him through a hole to talk between the driver of the cart and the person. But Art stopped thinking of her, and as he got to studying, the cart started shaking. Art wondered what was going on. Helen replied that it was a bandit attack, so she suggested others get ready for battle. Rose took out something and said to submit the O-wing and follow her will, so they gathered and protected. That made the cart rotate and created a tornado there, by which the bows that were coming to attack them became useless. And then Jasmine got down and seemed angry. Reynold was also angry, so he broke one bow with his hand. As they all got ready, Art saw that they were surrounded from all places. The attackers were humans. The leader came in front and said to his people to leave the woman and kid alive and to not leave any scars. The damaged goods would only sell for less. Art thought that he had almost forgotten that every world had its own share of filth like him. Art seemed angry, but Alive covered him and said not to worry because she was there to protect him. Then Durden, along with Reynold, used the bomb on some enemies, breaking the wall, and they all escaped from there. An arrow was heading towards Art, but Rose used her power to defend him. Reynold managed to strike down enemies, and by running so fast, he hit some more, but one came from behind and was about to slash his sword at Reynold. However, Helen used the bow and arrow to attack and kill that person. Jasmine then attacked the other people, and then they all fought with the others. A man tried to attack Jasmine with a rope-like weapon, but she dodged it. The man told her to stop struggling, and he would make sure to train her well, and she would beg to stay with him in the end. He then attacked rapidly, so some shots hit him, and a few of them injured her. Jack thought that she was at a disadvantage against her opponent's range, but could he help her? Being a fighter was one thing, but did he have a chance against an adult augmenter with that body? Just then, Reynold arrived with the cart in which Art was with his mother. Reynold received blessings from her mouth. As Art looked, he found that it was the leader of them all, and then he asked her mother to heal Reynold, but he felt something different in his mother because she hesitated to do that. Art wondered why she wasn't healing his father. Reynold told Alive that he was fine, and that the injury wasn't life-threatening. She started to heal, and told him not to worry and to do his best. Just then, Reynold told Art to listen to him, and after his mother used the healing spell, those bad people would go after her, and he would be able to fend off the leader, but not if he had to worry about protecting the two of them. So just take her back down the trail they came down and don't stop for anyone. Art replied that he wasn't going to leave them, and he could fight as well. Reynold tapped on his head and said to just listen because he knew Art could handle it, and that's why Reynold was trusting Art to protect his mother and the baby inside her. Art recalled his journey and realized that his mother had mentioned being tired frequently. Then Art realized that she was pregnant. Reynolds said that he had been thinking of telling them when they reached Isirus. Just then his father grabbed his shoulder, and Art promised that he would protect his mother. He got ready, and Alive used healing magic on Reynolds again. Reynolds mentioned that there were 4 mages on the enemy's side. The leader among them noticed there was a healer lady, so he ordered not to let her escape. Art grabbed her hand and urged her to go, thinking about his father not dying. Helen urged them to hurry and leave, but Art saw a man about to attack Alive, so Helen stepped in between. By blocking the way, she told Art that she would hold them back, so he should get away from there. One man threw a sword towards Art, so Art used his sword to block it, but his sword broke as well. The man was shocked to see that. Helen killed that man and told Art not to stop. As Art ran, he thought that something was wrong because there were 4 mages in front of him. He looked at the first one, then the second, and then the third, but he couldn't find the 4th one and wondered where he was. The leader instructed a man to forget their plan and not let them live. Art wondered who the man was talking to. Just then, he saw a man standing at the top of the terrain, ready to attack with a giant blue skill. As it came toward Art, he realized that if he used mana to dodge it, his mother wouldn't be fast enough to do the same. He felt sorry for the impending bruises. Pushing her away, he thought that he knew he couldn't avoid it, but he wanted to bring the mage down with him. He threw a knife between the blue rays, aiming for the leg portion of the 4th mage, hoping that the mana string would hold out. By tying himself with the string, he hung on to the 4th mage. Then, they both fell into a deep valley. Tears filled Art's eyes as he thought that everything seemed fine, but he had always wanted to be an older brother. Art reminisced about his past life. One morning he woke up and was going somewhere. All the servants bowed and greeted him. As he walked, he reached a room where an old man was reading books. Art saw Gray, which was his name in his past life. Gray looked at a photo of the council, the governing body responsible for managing the county's politics and economy. In a world riddled with problems like decreasing birth rates and limited resources, wars were waged by dukes and armies of kings, and Gray was one of them. The man stood and commented on Gray's admirable handwriting, mentioning that being part of the council was rewarding. He also said that he wasn't envious of the fame and glory kings received upon victories. Then, he asked Gray about his unexpected visit. Gray took off a medal and placed it on the table, announcing that he was retiring. Gray thought that he had spent his whole life striving to be the strongest, seeking fame and glory, yet he remained an orphan with everyone he cherished gone. He would give up all the things he had in that life for a chance to return to Ashba and see them all again. He stopped reminiscing, and as Art opened his eyes, he wondered how he had managed to survive. He then saw the 4th sage's body lying there, beaten and injured by birds. Art found some fruits nearby and struggled to get and eat one. After a while he tried to get up, but his whole body was shaking. However, he managed to barely stand up and remove the knife from the man. Looking at the mountain, he wondered how he had survived and how much time had passed and where he was. But he didn't dwell on that and continued forward. As he moved away, someone asked him if he was finally awake. Upon hearing that, Art hid behind the tree and was shocked to see that the man was also alive. The voice asked him how he was. Art wished to God that the man would get up. The unknown voice assured Art not to worry because the corpse wouldn't be reanimating, which was what he was afraid of. Then Art relaxed, but he soon realized that he didn't have to trust the unknown voice, no matter how silky smooth and dignified it was. Art asked who was talking to him, and if he was the one who had saved him. Art saw an animal running from there. The man admitted that he was the savior of Art, and to find out who he was, Art had to visit his dwelling. Art replied that it seemed the person was so confident that he would even try to find him. The voice told Art that with his help, Art would be able to get back to his home. Art thought that it was right, and Reynolds, along with the living, were the twin horns, and Art also had a baby sibling. Art wondered if they would be fine and reached Osiris safely. And then Art addressed the voice as Mr. and asked the voice if he could guide him in the direction so that he could have the honor of Art's presence. The voice replied that Art caught on quickly, though it was a bit rude to refer to a lady as Mr., but the sentiment was appreciated. Art wondered how she knew his name. The lady agreed to show him the way, and then something happened to Art. He was able to see a giant rock-like formation between the forest, and his eyesight was drawn closer to the rock. After that, Art returned to normal. The lady suggested that he start traveling during the day as it would be safer for him. Art began his journey and noticed that his body condition had improved, although he still experienced a few aches here and there. By afternoon, he couldn't help but feel the strain. He even crossed a bridge made from a tree and wondered what magic the lady had used to save him from that fall, how she knew they were falling, and why she had only saved him. As he contemplated these questions, more and more thoughts filled his mind. He then heard some voices, so he decided to check that out. As he climbed onto a rock, he saw a river, and without thinking, he jumped in to wash himself. The lady told him that he was such a careless person, but he didn't have to worry because there wasn't much to see. Art started getting ready and tried to remain calm. The lady apologized to him and told him not to pout. Art thought that his child's body was still developing. He drank some water while walking and ate some fruits. He thought that since he fell off from the mountain towards the east, he must be near the elves' domain, but he couldn't see any fog in the forest of Elsha. His fear of travelling through the best glades was quelled by the fact that he only saw small animals, and he was surprised that he hadn't seen any mana beasts considering how rich the place was in mana. He regretted that he couldn't stay to absorb some mana because he was in a hurry. He needed to get back to his parents, and since his mother was pregnant, the stress of his potential death might endanger the baby inside her. With all these thoughts in mind, he finally reached that mountain. The lady stated that she was glad he had arrived safely. Art handed her a route and said that it was nice to meet her. She told him that as intriguing as that would be, she wasn't a cluster of sentient rocks and he would find her within the crevice. Art saw some light and hesitated as he got closer, but he knew he had to get home soon, so he entered. As Art got inside, the lady warned him to take steps carefully, but just as his legs slipped and he fell in that valley, he thought that a warning that he was going to drop 2 stories down would have been nice. And as he was getting up, he fell again on the ground to see something and was so scared of looking at that, because there was a monster standing in front of him, and he wondered what that was. That monster was the lady whom he was talking to, and she commented that they had finally met. As she was stepping down near to him, he seemed more scared. She said that bugs would fly into his mouth if he kept it open so wide, so he closed his mouth. The lady took her hand near to him and said that it would take some time for her to open a dimensional portal to send him to his home, and there were special plants that would be able to nourish him until then. There were lots of different coloured plants shining around them. Art got up by thanking her. He then picked a purple-coloured plant and thought that it would be okay. He saw his face in that and was reminded of his family. The lady got on his back and by touching him with her hand, said that the plant he had was good in taste. Art was shocked to see her, and by that he put pressure on the plant to make it blast. And after that, they both got to eat the plants. While eating, Art said that he knew she was a lady, but was there any other name by which he could call her? She replied that she was Sylvia. Art asked if he could be allowed to ask some questions. Sylvia replied to just ask, although she might not be able to answer everything. He thought that with his initial fear of Sylvia's appearance slowly fading, he began to ask her all of the questions that had been on his mind since waking up from the fall. He questioned what that place was and why she was alone, where she came from, how she got that wound, and what the reason was for her saving him. She replied that his first question was easy, and that place was a narrow zone that rests between the Beast Glades and the Forest of Elsha. No one knew about that place because she had been warding off anyone who came close, and those cases were rare in the first place. He was the first person to enter into that domain. As she was calling him by his full name, he suggested she called him Art. She agreed to call him by that name. Then she continued that she was living there alone because she had no one left with her, and she had a lot of enemies who desperately wished for something that she had. Her last battle with her enemy was before she was able to escape, which left her with that wound. She saved him because she was moved by his courage and sacrifice, and she had simply grown lonely, though she didn't fully understand why. She would excuse herself for the night as her wound festered, and she would be in better condition to work on the dimensional rift the next day. He then bid her good night, and as the fearsome figure clad in dark armor walked away, he couldn't help but think how lonely she appeared. As she was leaving, she stopped and said that her sight was unable to reach exactly where they had gone, but his family and friends were safe, so it was up to him to make sure. He became emotional knowing they were all safe, and then he thanked Sylvia. He was practicing swords and picking up fruits to eat with Sylvia, and they spent hours talking about all sorts of things when he wasn't preparing the portal. Those hours bled into days and then into weeks while they spent every moment together, and while Sylvia never talked about her own life, Art slowly began to understand what sort of person she was. Once, when he was concentrating, he saw Sylvia picking the fruits, and he thought that she was the living embodiment of the phrase, "Don't judge a book by its cover." Contrary to her trauma-inducing appearance, she was kind, gentle, patient, and warm. She looked at him, and by taking fruits near to him, she asked if he had a chance to dine yet, and their fruits were particularly savory and rarely grew elsewhere. Art thought that she reminded him of his mother in that she was gentle and kind but firmly scolded him when he was wrong. As he took the fruit, he just remembered something unpleasant. There was a time when he had expressed his animosity towards the bandits and they deserved the worst death, and if any of them made it alive, he was going to find and kill them. By stating all that, he got into an aggressive nature, but Sylvia just hit him to make him fall. As he got up, he asked why she had done that. She was sitting in front of him and said that perhaps he wasn't wrong in what he was thinking about those bandits, and she chose not to save the maid he fell with for the same reason. However, letting his heart cloud with hatred and vengeance like that would only cause harm to him. Instead of that, he could continue living proudly with his life, with his gaze forward. He would come across misfortunes again, but he shouldn't let grief and rage corrode his mind. He should learn from them and face the future with a smile. Only then would he truly be victorious. She then asked him if she had hit him hard and if it was hurting. He thought that being lectured on morals and being uplifted by a figure that appeared to be the epitome of evil had oddly struck him deeply. She called him and asked why he hadn't been eating the fruit and if there was anything wrong. He replied that it was fine, and then started eating the fruit and commented on her wound, saying it seemed like it was getting worse. She replied not to worry and that the wound festered from time to time. He asked if that was really the case. She said that she had been meaning to ask if it was to her understanding that humans usually awaken around the age of 12 or 13. So how he had formed his mana core and was able to utilize mana more efficiently than many full-fledged mages. Art replied that his parents had said that he was a genius. She commented that so he would be able to learn that. He asked to learn what? She got up and said to meditate and absorb the mana while moving and perhaps while fighting if they were good enough. As she was doing that, he was shocked to see and asked how she was able to do that. She replied that humans had a very linear mindset regarding mana and usually started with small, mindless movements and worked their way up from there. He did something with his hand and said that it was easier said than done. Sylvia explained that mana beasts learned to do that naturally, but since humans usually awakened much later, their bodies weren't able to perform multitasking. Considering the latter fact didn't apply to him, if he practiced enough, he should be able to do that. Then Artie said that he would do his best for that. They both started to practice, and Artie slipped there, but he got up to practice more. He thought that practicing the skill to its fullest essentially meant being able to fight proficiently while still maintaining a steady inward flow of mana. He swung his sword a lot of times. He thought that it couldn't be like that, but then he became happy and said to Sylvia that he did it. However, he sensed that she was lying there. He was worried to see her like that. He rushed to her to check what had happened. But as he reached her, he found that she was bleeding, and his legs were touched by the blood. He used his power to turn her around and noticed that her wound was worsening so rapidly. But why? He saw a portal in front of him and thought that it couldn't be like that. Then he remembered all those times with her and realized that it was getting worse because she was creating the portal, and she did all that because of him. She told him that she was fine. Art was crying and asked how she could say that when she was sacrificing herself for him. He cried for longer than he cared to admit, and cried for the first time like the child he was on the outside. She asked him if he had calmed down any. He denied it, and she continued that they didn't have much time left together, and she would hate for it to be wasted with him blaming himself over that. Through his tears, he asked how he couldn't blame himself when she was sacrificing herself for him to be able to meet his family. She told him that he was doing her a favor by allowing her to leave that forsaken cave a bit faster, and her name didn't suit that form. Then the whole black body of hers started breaking, and a beautiful white creature appeared with wings. She then asked him if she currently looked more like Sylvia. He asked if she was a dragon. She agreed and said that she supposed she was what humans referred to as a dragon, but they had little time for idle chatter in that form. She needed to use her original form to finish the portal, but her disguise was gone, and danger would soon be coming. Art questioned who was coming. She then told him to just listen, and that there were some things she must say before they parted ways. She then gave him a rainbow-coloured small egg. He thought that it wasn't heavy, yet he felt like he could barely hold it. She then gave him one of her wings and instructed him to wrap the egg in it to conceal its aura and bear with her for one more thing. As she bit him, there were some symbols on his hands, causing him pain. Sylvia told him that everything would reveal itself when the time came. He looked into her eyes and asked if she was fine. She replied that she would open the portal and didn't have time to make it go directly home, but he should arrive somewhere near humans. He asked if she was leaving him. Just then some rocks fell on him, but Sylvia blocked those rocks and hid Art under her wings. Someone arrived in the same form as Sylvia and told her to cease her stubbornness and give that thing to her. The other person might even heal her wound. Art looked at that different creature and thought it was of the same form as Sylvia's previous form. That creature told Sylvia that she had already caused them trouble. Sylvia told Art that she had a confession to make, the truth to be told, and she intentionally prolonged the transportation spell so that she could spend more time with him. She wouldn't ask him to forgive her, but she had one more request. Could he call Sylvia grandma once? He held her wing, and by pulling away denied and told her to come with him. He didn't know what she did, but everything was frozen, and they could leave there together. She became emotional and said she couldn't, then freed herself to throw him into the dimensional portal, bidding farewell. He resisted, but then he called her grandma. She cried and thanked him for that.
Welcome to BMV Manhwa, your favorite place to watch manhwas. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content.
As Art came outside of that place, he found himself lying and he would never be able to meet her again. He tried to get up but was still lying and thought that his mind was swamped with memories of around 4 months he had spent with Sylvia. For a time he saw both long and short, and she always treated him like her son, teaching him all the things that he had lacked since coming to that world. He just felt something different. And just then he heard Sylvia's voice calling his name. Art asked if she really was Sylvia. She agreed and said that if he was listening to her, then that meant she had shown him what she actually was. He remembered that Sylvia had done something to him, and left that message. She told him that as frustrating as that might seem, he was nearly ready for the whole truth, and his body was that of a boy who had barely passed 4, and whose mana core had already progressed to the dark red stage. He wasn't strong enough. And as a small parting gift, she infused his unique will into him, and his future development as a mage would depend on how well he was able to use her gift. He wondered who asked for the gift. Sylvia continued that she could imagine what he might be feeling at that time, like sorrow, anger, guilt. But he just remembered that he had a family to look out for and a purpose to fulfill in that life, and her only wish for him was to embrace the joys and innocence of childhood and become a man of whom both his parents and she could be proud. Art saw the egg and took it. She continued that when his mana core was past the whole stage, he would hear from her once again, and at that time she would explain all things. So until then, she said goodbye, and she considered him as the King Grey. Art thought that questions continued to pester him long after the voice of Sylvia disappeared, and he wondered how long she had known his identity, and how she had even known. But there was one thing that was clear, that if he focused on training for the sake of revenge, that life would hardly be different from his last, and from that time he could only move forward. As he walked, he wondered where he was. He ran so fast, climbed trees, and headed ahead. He wondered that even with mana, his vision was restricted. But there was one thing he knew, that he was deep in the Elsha forest. Even just barely being able to use the mana restoration that Sylvia had taught him, he was able to use magic for a longer time, and still, he couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up there. Sylvia had told him that he would arrive at the position where there were some people nearby, and no matter what, he should just keep looking around, as he was getting pretty good at the tree-traveling business. As he jumped from tree to tree, he heard the screams of a human. He started heading towards that voice, hoping they could help him. As he came close, he saw a carriage and some men there. One said they should get ready as they were only a few days away from leaving that forest. The second one mentioned that elf girls were going for a lot. The third one added that the elf was a child too, so she hadn't done something like that, and she would definitely fetch them a lot. The boss told them to shut up, put her back in the carriage, and said they needed to move. Art realized that those were slave traders, and there was an elf with them. As they were heading, Art thought that he didn't have any idea how those people managed to get their hands on the forest hound, but he knew that getting one of them would be his best bet out of the forest. As for those slave traders, with all the crap that had happened to him lately, it looked like he would be able to let off some steam. By chasing them, he thought that, besides his eagerness to get back home, he had a different plan to deal with those slave traders. The first and best course of action would be attacking them. But he didn't strike immediately. Attacking all four would be suicide for him, so he followed them, waited, and gathered more strength to make his move when they least expected it. Finally, the time came when he took a stone to hit the tree. They all heard that, and one said to shut those hounds before they woke up everything in the forest. As he was going to do so, Art thought that without any weapon, he was forced to utilize a technique from his past life, and he wasn't even sure it would work in this world. Then something blue came over his hand. A man told the hounds that they should just chew each other's antlers if they were bored. Just then, Art came down and slashed the neck of that man, killing him. He then took a knife from the man's body. The hounds saw the dead body and started eating it. One of the larger hounds commented that the hounds were quiet and wondered what was taking their friend so long to come back, as he was urinating on something pink. Art quickly closed his mouth and slashed his knife at the man, killing him too. Art thought that it was as expected. Fighting was a lot harder and more tiring in this body, and he should finish this quickly while the last two were still asleep. Suddenly, someone said something. Art wondered what had just happened. The leader of the group asked why it was so noisy and where their comrades were. Just as the third one felt something, Art slashed his sword, but Art dodged and killed him as well. As he screamed, the leader saw, and the man said that the child was a mage. The leader was shocked and dropped his sword, saying that they didn't want to accidentally kill the golden egg that had just appeared in front of them. He then used magic, and said that the child might fetch them even more than the elf girl. Just then he came behind Art and said to don't die. He then attacked Art, but Art dodged and struck the leader's face with something. Art then attacked the man with his sword, which seemed imbued with blue magic. However, the leader grabbed the knife and dismissed it as a cute trick, then countered with an attack using Art's own knife. Art thought the man was incredibly fast. The man kicked Art, causing him to fall, and demanded that Art come to him. As he held Art upside down, he taunted that Art couldn't do anything with his small body. Art realized that considering mana like a blade seemed to behave similarly to wind magic in that world. If that was the case, he should use fire magic. He condensed the fire, creating a blast that exploded on the man's hand, burning it. Enraged, the man vowed to kill Art and didn't care if he had to sell Art's corpse. Art took his sword and attacked the man's neck, killing him. The remaining man pleaded not to be killed. Art thought that the little elf girl would say the same thing. He approached her, relieved, and told her it was safe outside, so she could return home. The elf's hands, mouth, and legs were tied with rope. Art then covered her eyes, and she asked for the reason. He replied that there were things kids were better off not seeing. She commented that he was also a kid. He agreed and told her not to take the cloth off until he told her to, and they should keep a good distance away. As they got some distance, he instructed her to open her eyes. She thanked him for saving her. He replied that it was nice to meet her. She then grabbed her shirt and asked how he could leave a small girl there, as she was so scared, and pleaded for him not to leave her. He explained that the bad guys wouldn't chase her anymore, and that he needed to get back home. Besides, weren't elves generally safe in that forest anyway? She disagreed and said that beasts were only scared of adults. Her parents had told her that kids would get eaten by hounds or the tree golems. Art then asked if she knew how long it would take to get to where she lived from there. She replied that she didn't know. Art became frustrated and told her to stay there while he went to gather some supplies, assuring her that the trip wouldn't be too long. She agreed. After that, Art salvaged what he could for their journey and packed a huge bag. He thought it was a shame they couldn't take the carriage, but it might be for the best as they would stick out like sore thumbs riding in it. He noticed the hounds and could only hope that the elves had something that could take him back to the human kingdom. He then went to Tessia and mentioned that he found some clothes inside the carriage, assuming they belonged to her, and she could wear the cloak over them since it might get cold. She took the clothes and thanked him. He patted her head and said, "Let's get back home." As they walked in the vague direction she pointed to, Art got to know more about the elf. He asked for her name, and she replied that it was Tessia, then inquired about his name. Art told her, and she asked how he ended up in the Elsha forest. He replied that it was a long story. She said they had plenty of time. They encountered many hounds in front of them, And afterward, Art explained that he was separated from his family. Tessia deduced that he came from the human kingdom. So it was true that all male humans were perverts and had more than one wife? Art asked who had told her that. Tessia replied that her grandpa had told her so. He then came and jokingly said that he was sure there were perverts among the elves as well, and then he asked if she knew the meaning of that word. She denied. He explained that only some nobles preferred to have multiple wives and then asked what it was like living in Eleanor. Tessia replied that it was fun, and she spent a lot of time with her caretakers and grandpa since her parents were busy. She mentioned that once she awakened, she would probably be given a mentor to train under, and she was excited about that prospect. Art commented that the education system seemed a bit more selective in Eleanor if everyone was assigned a private mentor upon awakening. He then showed her an animal and a knife, which scared her. She asked what he was talking about. Art replied that he was just talking to himself. While cooking the animal, Art was eating, and Tessia asked him what happened to those bad guys who were taking her away. He answered that they ran into a rather unfortunate accident. She asked if they would try to find her again. He promised that they wouldn't bother her again. She was happy to hear that and thanked him. As night fell, he told her to go and sleep. She then asked about him. Art replied that he would keep guard outside, so she went inside the tent they had made. Art thinks to use that time to check what Sylvia left for him. Just then, she came outside and asked if he really didn't want to rest. She mentioned that her grandpa had never shared the end of a story with a boy, but she wouldn't tell on him. He replied that he was fine and not sleepy. She agreed and said that beasts were more likely to appear if they noticed him there because they would see that he was a kid. She proposed that for their safety he should keep guard inside the tent for his security, not because she was scared. He went inside and told her to just sleep. She lay down, and he sat next to her, thinking that she was right, so she should get enough rest. Hi guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Art and Tessia continued their journey into the unknown surroundings of the forest, with time passing quickly as their only measure of progress. After Tessia's initial anxiety and discomfort had faded, it became obvious she didn't know how to interact with Art. He, admittedly, was worried about his family and impatient to return home, which put him in a bit of a bad mood. As they set up camp for the night, an axe fell from Art's hand. What made the journey almost unbearable were the agonizing pains from his mana core that struck unpredictably. Tessia approached him to ask if he was okay. He agreed, and they headed to sleep, though his hand still throbbed. As they continued their journey, Art noticed wolves were trailing them. He conjured a blue light in his hand, scaring them off. Glancing at Tessia, he realized the pain was increasing in frequency, but he didn't want to worry her by telling. Days passed and Tessia struggled more and more with the indistinguishable surroundings, their pace slowing as her body couldn't keep up with the constant travel. Art decided to carry the small luggage himself, focusing on strengthening his body with mana, but the pain kept increasing, becoming harder to conceal from Tessia. Once, while walking, he stumbled, and she grew very concerned. Art quickly pretended to be embarrassed, blaming it on nature calling. As they continued walking, Tessia brought up the idea of calling him by the nickname his family used. Art didn't mind at all, but Tessia was upset by his lack of reaction. He reassured her that he would be honored to be called Art. Tessia teased him for sounding like an old man, to which Art replied with a playful jab about her inability to control herself, even with him nearby. This led to a playful exchange where Tessia shut his mouth, but they both laughed it off. Tessia then spotted a symbol on a tree and excitedly pointed it out to Art, who saw it as just another part of the landscape. Despite their differing perspectives, they seemed to be connecting on a deeper level. Tessia placed her hand on several trees with the same symbol, declaring they had finally arrived. One tree began to glow, revealing the entrance inside. She entered and urged Art to follow. As they entered, Art stumbled, cursing teleportation gates for their unpredictability. Once steady, he took in the sight before him, a world that seemed almost pristine. Elves gazed at them with curious eyes, giving Art the impression of a place untouched by time. But even that word didn't quite capture the beauty of what lay before him. Suddenly, green lights appeared, and elves emerged, welcoming Tessia as if she were a royal princess. Art was utterly bewildered by this revelation. One of the elves explained that they had hurried there as soon as they detected the activation of the teleportation gate, and Tessia's parents were also present. Tessia's mother expressed relief at her daughter's safety. Among them stood an old man, whose name, Virion, Art recalled from history books as the former king of Manhwa, renowned for leading the last war against the humans of the Sapin kingdom. Art gently pushed Tessia towards her parents, and they embraced warmly, a reunion filled with joy and relief. Art anticipated that his parents would react similarly upon seeing him. Virion expressed his gratitude not as the king of Manhwa, but simply as Tessia's father, thanking Art for safely escorting her home. He then requested, in a tone that seemed gentle but left no room for refusal, that Art accompany them to their home to rest before recounting what had happened. Art graciously accepted the offer, recognizing the underlying expectation. Tessia surprised everyone by grabbing Art's hand, leaving her parents visibly shocked. She whispered to Art that there was much she wanted to show him. Art couldn't help but wonder if he had stumbled into some cheesy novel as Tessia led him into the castle. Inside, Art couldn't help but be impressed by the grandeur of the castle, though he had somewhat expected it after learning of Tessia's royal status. Tessia's mother, Muriel, instructed the maids to attend to Art, declaring him their guest and insisting he be washed up and given a room to rest. Art expressed his gratitude but insisted on explaining what had happened first. As they all gathered, Art stood up, bowing respectfully before introducing himself. He hailed from a humble town in the kingdom of Sapin, and he felt honored to be in the presence of the royal family. He thought his introduction might have been a bit over the top, but he believed it necessary to ensure they treated him seriously. Virion remarked that despite Art's humble origins, he seemed mature and well-educated, expressing curiosity about his story. Art began recounting his journey, starting with a vague account of getting separated from his family after encountering bandits. It wasn't the whole truth, but he felt it necessary to withhold certain details. As he reached the part of the story where he had encountered their daughter, the atmosphere shifted. Alduin grew visibly angered, condemning the slave traders responsible and emphasizing that they were human. Art, with all due respect, pointed out that slave trading was a profession, not a characteristic of a particular race. However, before he could continue, a guard interjected, clearly agitated. Virion intervened, silencing the guard, allowing Art to proceed. Art clarified that he had witnessed the slave traders taking Tessia and him, and rather than negotiating or begging for mercy, he had taken action as a mage to eliminate the threat and rescue Tessia. The guard accused Art of lying, but Virion's stern gaze silenced him once more. Art insisted that whether they believed him or not, Tessia had been safely returned, and his only desire at that moment had been to reunite with his family in Sapin. Tessia's expression shifted to concern upon hearing Art's desire to leave. A solemn silence fell over them as they exchanged looks. Art reassured Tessia, explaining that given the history between humans and their kingdom, it wasn't wise for him to stay too long. His priority was ensuring his family's safety and letting them know he was all right. Alduin interjected, acknowledging that despite the past animosity between their kingdoms, Art had saved their daughter and gone to great lengths to bring her back. He suggested that Art deserved a fitting reward. Unfortunately, the teleportation gate linked to the Sapin kingdom only opened once every 7 years, during the summon conference involving all 3 races. With 5 years until the gate would reopen, they offered to send a group of guards to escort Art safely home. They also extended their hospitality, though Alduin cautioned that while some were tolerant, many still held grudges from the war long ago. For the time being, Art was invited to make himself at home, and the escorts would be ready by the next morning. Art expressed gratitude for the offer and headed to his room, feeling exhausted. As he bathed, his pain intensified, growing increasingly unbearable. Once out of the bath, he found solace sitting with the egg Sylvia had given him, hoping it would provide some relief. However, his respite was interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, Art was met with Tessia, who playfully bumped her head against his chest, chiding him for being distant with her family before planning to leave. Art defended himself, explaining that he was merely showing respect to the king and queen. Tessia teased him, prompting him to ask her to stop. Tessia confessed that she didn't want Art to leave because he was her first friend. Touched, Art reassured her and suggested she show him around the castle. As they walked, Tessia led him to her favorite spot, expressing her hope that they could stay until spring so he could witness the flowers in bloom. She excitedly pointed out the glow bees harvesting, then showed him something shiny, marveling at its beauty. Just as Art sensed something coming towards Tessia, he instinctively pulled her down and intercepted the object. Reacting swiftly, he identified Varian as the culprit and confronted him, shocked that he would try to harm his own granddaughter. Varian nonchalantly remarked that the object would have left only a small mark, doubting its lethality. Art realized it was a fake knife and felt deceived. Varian commended Art's quick reflexes and instincts, noting that while his manner usage was mediocre, he could see how Art had managed to dispatch the slave traders. Art questioned Varian's sanity, bewildered by his actions. Tessia intervened, urging Varian to stop teasing Art. Varian explained that there was a reason for his actions. Art was intrigued, wondering what Varian meant. Varian revealed that it had been a while since he had met someone with Art's level of interest. Handing Art a wooden sword, he invited him to see what he had created. Art grabbed the sword and swiftly swung it at Varian, catching him off guard. Tessia watched in shock as blue rays emanated from Varian, deflecting Art's attack. Varian labeled Art as a scary little brat before engaging in battle. Despite Art's efforts, Varian's skill proved formidable. Varian disarmed Art, causing the sword to fall from his hand, but Art agilely caught it with his leg, continuing the fight. Art realized that even with his manner and strategic movements, he couldn't match Varian's prowess. Varian launched a surprise attack at Art's leg, attempting to make him fall, but Art countered, rolling faster and delivering a decisive blow to Varian's head. As the sword plunged into the ground, Art fell back, exhausted. Tessia rushed to their side, concerned. Varian acknowledged that perhaps he deserved Art's retaliation for underestimating him. Tessia didn't seem pleased with the outcome. When Varian suggested a round 2, Tessia pinched him, insisting he should go easier on Art. Varian gestured that if he went easier, Art might end up bullying him instead. Art laughed, feeling honored by Varian's respect. As Varian's expression softened towards Art, Art couldn't help but feel surprised by the sudden change. Then, to Art's astonishment, Varian suggested that if Art felt that way, he could become his disciple. Tessia looked bewildered by the unexpected turn of events. Varian turned to Art and asked if he agreed to become his disciple. Art hesitated, wondering if Varian was serious. Varian reassured him, stating that he wouldn't allow anyone to kick Art out while he was under his tutelage. Art, feeling torn, reminded Varian that he was human and questioned if it was allowed for a human to stay in their kingdom. Varian assured him that no one would dare challenge Art's presence under his guidance. Art hesitated again, acknowledging that he was already more skilled than many other children, and even some adults. He believed he could teach Varian something that even the most capable mages in Sapien couldn't. However, he couldn't accept Varian's offer. Not when he didn't know the fate of his parents or whether they were even aware if he was alive or dead. Varian proposed a solution, suggesting that if there was a way for Art to see how his parents were doing and communicate with them to let them know he was fine, would that be enough? Art was intrigued but unsure of what Varian meant. Just then, Varian noticed Tessia beginning to feel sleepy. He instructed Art to wait and ordered a maid to take Tessia to wash up and put her to bed. Varian then admitted that his impatience stemmed from what he had sensed during their spar. Art had been experiencing bouts of searing pain near his mana core, and they were becoming more frequent. Art was taken aback by Varian's awareness of his condition. Varian explained that more concerning than his knowledge was Art's lack of understanding about the cause of his pain. Then, he posed a question to Art: did he know what a beast will was? When Varian asked Art to join him as a beast tamer, Art agreed. Varian showed him how to tame the beasts. Art knew it was important to return to his family, but he also knew the risks involved. The power from the beast was too strong for his young body to handle. If he didn't learn to control it soon, it would destroy him from the inside out. As Art slept, he felt a heavy weight pressing down on him, like the personification of all his worries and burdens. It seemed like the expectations placed on him were haunting even his dreams. Tessia tried to wake him up, but he referred to her as a monster and asked for just 5 more minutes of sleep. She got angry at being called a monster. When he finally woke up, she teased him about his messy hair, and he teased her back. She asked if he was really going to stay here, as Grandpa had mentioned it in the morning. Art replied that they might know more after the trip with Virion and the princess. Tessia pinched him for calling her princess and asked him to use her name instead, warning him she'd get angry if he kept it up. He agreed and asked her to leave the room so he could shower. Tessia joked that he seemed like a pervert, and Art asked her not to say such things. After his shower, he left the mansion, only to find Alduin confronting his father about a human residing in their kingdom. Muriel told Virion that Alduin was right, and while she was grateful to the boy for saving Tessia, allowing a human to stay there went against tradition. Virion responded that he had taken a liking to Art, and there was no need to say more. Besides, Tessia agreed with that as well. Alduin urged them to reconsider, but Virion insisted that it was enough, and that Art would be under his direct guidance, making sure everyone in the kingdom knew that. Art came downstairs, thinking that the elders could really be trusted. Virion told him to hurry and get inside. They left, and while travelling, Art asked how much longer they had to go and jokingly referred to Virion as Gramps. Virion remarked that it seemed Art wasn't too comfortable with him. Art replied that they would have to see how the day went with Virion's mysterious friend. Just Tessia fell asleep on Art's shoulder. Virion remarked that Tessia had woken up unusually early that day and had been talking about Art. He asked if that was true. Virion gently touched her face and explained that being the only princess of the kingdom had caused her to grow up in a lonely environment. She had been hurt too many times by both adults and children pretending to be her friends, which had made her grow cold and distant, constantly building walls around herself. In short, Virion had noticed that she seemed happier around Art, showing more smiles and laughs than she had in the last few years, and he thanked Art for that. After a while, the carriage stopped, and Tessia woke up, asking if they had arrived. They stepped out of the carriage in front of a house. Art wondered who the mysterious friend was that had brought the former king all the way to this rural area. Virion knocked on the door and called for the old witch, telling her they had arrived, so she should come out. A lady emerged from the house, teasingly remarking that her ears were still working properly. Virion then introduced Rinia to Art, explaining that she was an old friend and a special deviant who could help him. Art bowed and said it was a pleasure to meet her. Rinia mentioned they didn't have all day and urged them to stop standing outside and come in. As they entered, Art thought that being a deviant meant she was similar to his mother, whose magic didn't fall into the categories of the 4 basic elements. He wondered how she would be able to help him. As they sat down, Art apologized for sounding impatient, but Virion reassured him that Rinia's magic would help him find his parents. Rinia remarked that Virion had a soft spot for Art and explained that she possessed a divine power, a magic that varied from mage to mage but was capable nonetheless. She could see aspects of Art's life that even she couldn't fully understand, with glimpses of both his past and future. However, she wasn't there solely for her clairvoyant abilities, she was there to help Art reunite with his parents. Art agreed with her assessment. Rinia instructed Art to lean forward and keep his eyes fixed on the basin of water. She told him to focus as clearly and as detailed as possible on the image of his parents. Once he could see them in the water, he would be able to talk to them. After doing something to him, Art thought of his mother, with her glowing auburn hair and sun-kissed complexion radiating a gentle warmth. He remembered her furrowed brows, always knitted together with worry about him. Then he thought of his father, with his strong blue gaze and goofy smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. He remembered his father's silly jokes and easygoing nature at home, contrasting sharply with his charisma as a leader and fighter. Art imagined them both to be alive, and then he opened his eyes and looked into the water. Art watched as his mother cooked food and served it to his father. Reynold remarked that the beef stew looked amazing and asked if there was any special occasion. Alice replied that there wasn't. It had just been a while since she had cooked for him since they moved to the house. She thought to herself how it was the favourite food of both Art and Reynold. Reynold asked her what she meant, but she brushed it off, simply sitting there. As Reynold went to eat, Art called out to him, announcing himself. Shocked, his parents looked at each other. Art explained that they might be surprised to hear from him, but he would explain everything later. For now, they should know he was safe and alive. He had managed to survive the fall off the cliff, and they should keep it a secret. Currently, he was staying in the kingdom of Eleanor with the elves. He knew it was hard for them, but he was glad they were both fine. He hoped they didn't blame each other for what had happened. He felt proud of what he had done back then, and if he could go back in time, he would do it all over again, even if it meant risking his life. He wished he could go to them now, but it seemed that would be difficult at the moment. He mentioned he had some sort of illness that needed treatment. Although he wasn't in immediate danger, he needed to get treated before heading back home. He wasn't sure when he'd be able to reach out like this again. There was a mage there, similar to his mother, who was enabling them to hear his voice. Art assured his father that he would keep practicing magic and fighting while recovering. He joked not to be surprised if he could beat his father in a match the next time He urged his parents to take care of his mother and the baby. Reynold and Alice became emotional upon hearing this. Alice rushed to hug Reynold, but he told her to slow down. Art expressed his love for them both and told them to take care of themselves until he returned. Then Art began to cry too, saying he was ready. As they returned to the mansion, Virion, Tessia, and Art walked in together. Just as they were entering, Alduin stopped Art and remarked that years of being a king had made him a bit old-fashioned and stubborn. Meriel placed her hand on Art's shoulder and explained that what Art was trying to say was that they were sorry for earlier, so he should accept their apology and consider the mansion as his own. Alduin added that Art was the saviour of his daughter and his father's first disciple, so he welcomed Art again, and they shook hands. Art thanked him for his generosity. However, Tessia interjected, suggesting that if Alduin really apologized to Art, they should let both of them play outside, and she wanted Art to show him around the city. After some time, Art sat on the stairs, and Tessia came by, getting ready to go out, and then they both went to watch over the market. Suddenly, Art bumped into a boy. The boy commented that Art had human germs on him and insinuated that just because Virion favoured Art a bit, Art shouldn't think he belonged there. Tessia brushed off the encounter, but Art couldn't help but see the boy as a blatantly cliché side character and felt a mischievous urge to mess with him. The boy then said to Tessia that while he appreciated her kindness, it was beneath his status to be seen with a commoner like Art, and he asked to escort Tessia instead. Art teased the boy by using his name mockingly. Another boy intervened, hitting Fair and praising his recent awakening genius, despite his young age. Fair demanded to know why he was being addressed like that. He got worked up, but Art still regarded him as ignorant. However, Fair then bowed and acknowledged that he didn't realize he was in the presence of such a genius and promised to show Art proper respect in the future. As they started to leave, Fair stopped and questioned whether Art thought he couldn't see through his sarcasm. Art realized Fair wasn't as dense as he had initially thought. Fair, for the pride of the FCR house, then challenged Art to a duel. Tessia stepped in between and questioned Fair's audacity in initiating a duel with Virion's disciple. She reminded him that despite his noble blood, he should still know his place. Fair apologized to Tessia, explaining that his father had taught him never to let anyone trample on his pride. Then he turned to Art, challenging him to accept the duel or retreat with his tail between his legs, noting that Art's decision would reflect on his mentor, Virion, as well. Art wondered if the duel was taken seriously in their circles. Fair interpreted Art's silence as acceptance and asked Tessia to officiate the duel. Tessia assumed the role of referee and instructed them to start the duel. Fair warned Art to prepare himself, boasting that his genius would However, as Fair moved to attack, Art swiftly punched him back, causing Fair to fall. Art asked him if he was done. Tessia, not surprised by the outcome, grabbed Art's hand and ran away from the scene. Art couldn't help but appreciate Tessia more and more, and although the rest of the day wasn't as fun as playing ball with Fair, it distracted him from other thoughts. Later, when Art was alone at a shop, a man attempted to leave, but stopped when Tessia arrived. They all went to a building where Tessia informed Art that his training would start the next day and asked if he was nervous. Art didn't reply. Virion assured Art that his lessons wouldn't be easy and that he would endure pain from his mana core. The assimilation process used by beast tamers was likened to submerging one's body in boiling tar, leaving them stranded in a foreign land without the comfort of family. Even Art's daily life would become arduous, but if he could endure it, the payoff would be enormous. Art replied that he was excited and ready for the challenge, having come a long way and feeling excited about everything, including training. Hi guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content. The scene shifts 3 years later, where Tessia asks Art to let's go because they're going to be late. She grabs his leg and pulls, prompting Art to give in and agree to go. However, he discovers that she used her mana to twist his ankle. Couldn't she have found a gentler way to wake him up? She retorts that it wasn't her fault he didn't wake up when she asked him nicely. Besides, he should feel grateful that such a pretty girl like her was waking him up. He replies that he finds the maids there very pretty. She asks if he said anything. Heading downstairs, she asks if he thought the maid was pretty. He asks her to leave that topic. Virion mentions that they both took a long time, so he got them ready for their lessons. Art thinks that there exist 4 basic elements and their higher forms. Those higher elements are ice, gravity, lightning and sound, and they can only be controlled by a mage who has gone beyond mastery of their foundational elements. They could call that as deviance. Dwarves can only manipulate earth and fire, but elves possess a much higher affinity to those 2 elements. And their distinct tarot trait lies in the fact that all dwarves could mold and bend metal, while talented dwarves could control fire and earth to such a high degree that they were able to conjure and manipulate magma. Elves were only limited to water, wind and earth elements, but with a much higher affinity than humans. In rare cases, elves could also produce a special deviant type capable of controlling plants. However, elves weren't able to produce mages that could manipulate the higher forms of water and earth. Human mages possess the ability to manipulate any 4 of the basic elements. They were also the only race capable of producing deviance in any of those elements, along with anomalies that couldn't be categorized into any of the elements, like emitters and healers. There exists a suitable power balance between the 3 races, taking into account population, overall inherent affinity to the elements, and diversity in mages. He then asks Virion if that was enough explanation. Virion replied that it was passable. Tessia was lying there next to Art. Just Tessia raised a question that she knew the whole assimilation process was meant to get Art's body ready to handle his best will, but wouldn't it have been better to have him train his body physically while using magic? Art thinks that he knew all along from his lessons beforehand, but the difference in the races really showed over those 3 years. While humans were considered talented, they typically awakened in their late preteen years. It wasn't surprising for Sleven children to awaken as soon as 10, and for Tessia, that had happened even earlier at the tender age of 9. Virion asks Tessia if she's angry that she's only getting beat up in training. She agrees and then looks at Art. Art thinks that since then she had been training her conjuring skills with a tutor while learning to fight from her grandfather, and she was going to be quite the monster in the future, though he shouldn't be one to talk. Virion tells Tessia that what Art had been doing those 3 years was basically fusing his bones, muscles and organs with his mana, and he hadn't been physically training like her. But Virion could assure her that once that was over, his body would be stronger and more resilient than a veteran warrior. She asked if that was for real, wondering why he was so sensitive when she hit him. He replied that he still felt pain. Virion said that it seemed like the process of fusion hadn't sapped away his energy enough, so was he ready? And after that day he would be a true beast tamer, unlike those lucky adventurers who merely used their beast will like tools. He was going to ignite Art's mana by inserting a large amount of his own mana. Art would feel a bit warm, but that shouldn't be too bad. Then he created a white light and placed his hand on Art's chest. Art felt a lot of pain, and then a blast hit him, causing him to be thrown back and hit with a tree before falling to the ground. Virion and Tessia were shocked to see that, and they both rushed to him. Tessia asked if he was fine. He replied that he was fine. Virion said to him that he knew Art had his reasons for not telling Virion until then, but he had to ask what sort of beast gave its will to him. Art replied that the beast was a dragon. Virion was shocked to hear that it was a dragon. Art said that it was a real dragon tamer, and he was trained by her. He fainted there, and after he woke up, he found himself lying on the bed. Virion was sitting next to him and asked how he was feeling. Art replied that he should be asking that question, and the last thing he remembered before falling unconscious was Virion going crazy. Virion replied that he had calmed down. Art commented that it was good and he could trust them to keep that a secret even after he left. Virion mentioned that on the topic of leaving, the date of his departure had been set for 4 months from then. Art was shocked and said that he thought it would be another 2 years. Virion replied that an interracial tournament among the 3 kingdoms' youths, which had been in the works, had finally been confirmed. Portals in the Cyrus city of Sapin would be open to both the Eleanor kingdom and the kingdom of the Darv during that time. Art asked why Tessia wasn't there, so Virion told him that he shouldn't worry about her. He knew that Art had been checking in on them over the past few years through Rinia, but Art would finally be able to see them in person. Art agreed and said that 4 months still felt pretty soon. Virion moved his hands on Art and said that he would make Art wish those 4 months were over soon. Now that Art had finished his assimilation, his training would get even harder. Art should take some rest, and Virion was going to tell that to Tessia gently before he left. Art thought of the 4 months, and then saw the small edge he got from Sylvie, which was breaking a bit. Art wondered if the small edge was breaking. Suddenly it really did break, and a small monster emerged from it, yawning as it lay down. Art lifted it up and realized it was a dragon, incredibly cute. Just then, the dragon bit his hand, leaving a mark. Art heard someone calling Mama and wondered who it was, then looked at the dragon. The calls continued several times. Art, getting back to bed, wondered if she could talk inside his mind. He told the dragon to call him Papa, not Mama, and the dragon complied. Art hugged her and said he would call her Sylvie, after her mother. Sylvie made some sounds and Art asked if she liked that. He could really feel a connection, and it seemed like the mark wasn't as simple as it looked. It felt like it was actually connecting him to the little dragon. At 8 years old, with a tattoo, he was now a father. He was truly a rebel. As Art was sleeping in his room, he suddenly heard someone screaming and woke up, wondering who it was. He realized it was Tessia, lifting Sylvie and commenting on how cute she was. Then Art went back to sleep. The next day they both came downstairs and Tessia learned that Art was able to communicate with the monster in her mind. She thought Art was lucky, and maybe she could communicate with the monster too, and it would like her as well. Art replied that the dragon would like Tessia if she stopped looking at her like she was some sort of predator. Tessia called Virion and told him to come and see Art's pet. Virion was shocked to see Sylvie, and after calming down he said that he was going to die early if he kept getting shocked like that. Art explained everything to Virion, including where Sylvie had come from, and he learned that beings like Sylvie usually only hatch in the presence of their kin. They tried to think of why she might have hatched in front of Art, but the only reason they could think of was the fact that he had fully activated Sylvie's will the previous day. During training, Art asked Virion if he thought he would have to hide Sylvie once he returned, as most people wouldn't know she was so powerful. Virion replied that Art should just pass her off as a rare mana beast. However, they had other things to worry about. They had held back on strengthening Art's mana core during the assimilation, but now that he had fully awakened, they needed to focus on training both his core and his new dragon will. Art asked what he needed to do. Virion smirked and, throwing a sword, said that he found the best way to access the first stage of Art's beast will, along with strengthening his mana core, was to constantly engage in combat. Art agreed that it made sense to him. Virion added that it would also make sense for Art to fight a fellow beast tamer, as using those skills against his will would help him even more. With a roar, Virion transformed into a beast and asked Art to fight. Art thought that beast mages were capable of harnessing the unique abilities inherited from mana beasts. The first stage, known as the acquire phase, allowed the beast tamer to borrow the beast's inherent strengths. However, it was only at the second stage, the integrate phase, that the mage could truly utilize their beast's unique abilities and characteristics. For Virion, who had only unlocked that second stage after decades of studying his beast will, he was now able to utilize the deadly prowess of a shadow panther. The beast urged Art to pay attention while it sneaked up behind him. Art wondered if it was saying that it could sneak up on him even after warning him. Suddenly, the beast disappeared and came from behind to place its hand on Art. Art thought it was so fast, and as he turned to attack, he found it had disappeared again and came at his back. Art surrendered, admitting that he couldn't even react to its speed at that level, and frankly, its form was trauma-inducing. Then Virion transformed into his elf form and said that he had been told, and it wasn't without its flaws. Using the integrate phase still took a bit out of him. Art replied that the movements were flawless, but even when Virion was behind him, he couldn't feel his presence. Virion picked up the sword and said that shadow panthers were able to instinctually manipulate wind and sound to achieve those effects. He thought he had bullied Art enough and suggested they actually start training. Days passed for Art, completely immersed in training. Through Virion's guidance and his own insights, he was able to access the first stage of his dragon will, and Virion had also taught Art to conceal the presence of his beast will in front of other mages. When he wasn't strengthening his mana core or studying Sylvie's dragon will, he was sparring against Virion. Luckily, the assimilation process allowed his body to keep up with the constant training and conditions. During his downtime, he spent as much time as he could embracing the joys and innocence of childhood, as Sylvie had wished for him, until the day of departure finally came. Spending every day together, those last few years made breaking the news of his approaching departure that much harder on Tess. Hi guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content. As Art was about to head inside the carriage, he saw Faerith there. Faerith asked who was with them and inquired if Art had been kicked out of the kingdom. Art asked who the boy was. Faerith shouted that he was the noble Art had beaten unfairly by defying the customs of the duel. He explained that everyone but a foolish human like Art knew a real duel was meant to be a demonstration of magic, with the challenger always striking first. Art recalled a bit about Faerith. Faerith introduced himself as the heir to the noble Ivesar family and mentioned that while he might have been defeated underhandedly when he was a naive child, if they were to fight now, things would be different. Just then, Art grabbed Faerith's hand and told him it was nice to meet him, apologizing for bullying him in the past. As Art sat there, a girl told him that he could call Faerith Fife as they all did. Faerith responded that she didn't need to tell Art that. While talking and travelling, they arrived in the human world. Art looked outside, thinking that this was the place where his parents were living, the floating city of Xerus. He walked through the market and reached a mansion. He said to Sylvie that they were finally home and asked if she was ready. He then knocked on the door and thought about how he had nearly died, lost someone important, killed and trained for his life, but now wondered if those things were as nerve-wracking as this moment. As he knocked, someone replied that they were coming. Art thought it sounded like a young girl's voice. Then a lady opened the door and asked how she could help him. Art bowed, greeted her, and introduced himself, mentioning that he had heard his family was currently residing in this manor. Just then, Art saw a small girl who was curious about the visitor. Alice, carrying some food, came by looking for Eleanor and found her at the gate. She asked Eleanor why she mentioned getting everyone who knocked at the door. When Alice saw Art at the gate, the food fell from her hands. Art asked if Eleanor was his sister. Becoming emotional, he then told his mother that he had come back. Overcome with emotion, Alice rushed to hug him, exclaiming that she recognized his voice and that it really was Art who had returned to her. Eleanor asked Alice not to cry. When Raymond heard the news, he came home, calling for Art. The old lady showed Art to Alice. Reynold arrived and seeing Art hugged him as well, crying. After that, they sat together and Alice asked Art how he was feeling, mentioning his illness and whether he was fully treated. She noted how thin he looked and asked if he was eating 3 meals a day. Art replied that he was fine. Reynold gently chided Alice for asking so many questions at once and reassured her that they could see how big and strong Art had become. Alice agreed and then asked Eleanor to come and say hi to her big brother. Eleanor, curious about who this big brother was, came closer. Alice explained that this was the brother whose stories their parents had been telling her before bedtime. Eleanor approached and said hello to him. Art shook hands with her and said it was finally time they met. After that, he began to tell them everything from the beginning. While recounting his experiences to his family, he chose to leave out details about Sylvia, explaining his survival from falling off the cliff as a combination of luck and his body's unconscious use of magic to protect him. From there, he continued, finding Tessia and spending time in the kingdom of Eleanor, recovering. Then, Reynolds asked about Sylvie. Art explained that while he was travelling, he stumbled into a manor beast's den where Sylvie's mother was dying from an injury. Though he couldn't do anything for Sylvie's mother, he had been taking care of Sylvie since then. Alice asked if he was sure that he was fully healed and if there was any chance of the illness returning. Art reassured her that she didn't have to worry anymore, explaining that his illness had more to do with the instability of his mana core from awakening so early. He felt bad for keeping secrets from them, but until he became stronger, it was dangerous for them to know everything. Reynolds asked about the stage of Art's mana core. Alice told Reynolds that Art had just arrived and Reynolds began discussing mana core stages. Reynolds wondered what was wrong with comparing their growth, mentioning that since they arrived, he had been working as the instructor for the Helstia auction house guards. Art joked that it wasn't just Reynolds' facial hair that had grown and inquired about Reynolds' current mana core stage. Reynolds smiled and said he had broken through 2 years ago, entering the dark orange stage. Art thought it was easy to notice that Reynolds had bulked up and had advanced to the next stage. He then commented that Reynolds must have worked hard but was still acting differently. Reynolds asked about Art's mana core stage. Art replied that it was light red. Shocked, Reynolds exclaimed, "Really? Light red? That's amazing." Suddenly, Eleanor repeated the word shit. Alice told Art it was amazing but reminded Reynolds to be mindful of Eleanor before using such language. Reynolds then told Eleanor not to repeat that word again. Reynolds then asked again to confirm, "Are you really at the light red stage? How and when did that happen?" He then suggested to Art, "Let's go to the backyard and spar." Art laughed, thinking to himself that it was good to be back. A man rushed over, asking Reynolds if Art was really alive and what was going on. Art saw the man with his family and realized they were the ones taking care of his own family. Reynolds invited Vin and Tabby to meet his son, who had returned. He introduced Vin to Art, explaining that Vin was running the Helstia auction house and was an old friend of Reynolds, currently working with him. Reynolds asked Art to introduce himself before they started sparring. Art bowed and said he was pleased to meet them, acknowledging that his return might come as a surprise. He explained that he had asked his parents not to tell anyone about his condition and apologized for any confusion. Vin playfully smacked Reynolds and asked Art if he was really related to his father. Reynolds chuckled, saying that he got asked that a lot, but the answer was yes. Tabby told Art it was wonderful to see him back home and then introduced Lilia to Art, hoping they would become friends since they were of the same age. Art smiled at Lilia. Just then, Lilia saw Sylvie and found her so cute. She asked Art if she could touch her. Vin asked about the wrecking his house, and Reynolds explained that he and Art were about to spar. Vin was surprised to hear that. As they got there, Vin saw that they were indeed sparring. They were all in the backyard, with Art standing against Reynolds, both stretching. Alice was talking with Tabby while sitting on the stairs and Lilia and Eleanor were playing with Sylvie. Vin said to Alice that he couldn't believe Reynolds was serious about Art being a light red core mage. Tabby asked Vin to sit with her. Alice said she was also surprised but mentioned that Art had always been a fast learner and had no reason to hide it. Vin was astonished to believe that an 8-year-old boy had not only awakened but had progressed through 3 stages. Even the genius brats admitted into Cyrus Academy were barely at the dark red stage, and they were 11 or 12 years old. Art thought it might be best not to tell them that he was only at the light red stage because he couldn't train his core while assimilating with Sylvia's beast will. Reynolds hoped that Art was ready, mentioning that he wasn't the same as before. Art got ready as well, saying that he wasn't like in the past either. Art rushed forward so fast he seemed to disappear, aiming a punch at Reynolds. However, Reynolds blocked the attack and said that Art would have to try harder than that. Art freed himself by kicking Reynolds' hand, and they continued fighting. At one point, Reynolds managed to attack Art, but Art grabbed Reynolds' clothing and threw him away. Reynolds regained his balance by jumping several times. Art asked what Reynolds was thinking. Reynolds replied that it wasn't bad and admitted Art had caught him off guard, but now he was going to be serious. He then made fire rays appear around his hands and said it was a little trick he learned after breaking through to the dark orange stage. He warned Art, telling him not to say he hadn't been warned. Art then thought about the differences in awakening abilities between conjurers and augmenters. In their world, conjurers had the innate advantage of being able to manifest and manipulate their affinity element, while for augmenters, their elemental affinities were more subtle, and actual manifestation of elements only occurred after crossing a certain threshold. Reynolds had fought and trained hard since a young age, but without formal training, it took him until the orange core stage to turn his explosive mana usage into real fire. In Art's world, elements weren't predetermined from birth but rather a path chosen willingly. Talent played a significant role, but since no one was restricted to just one affinity, hard work also mattered. Art had many advantages since coming to this world, and all of them culminated in his current abilities. He then told his father that he had learned 1 or 2 tricks as well. With that, he generated electric waves around him and warned Reynolds not to be surprised by them. Vin was shocked to witness Art's deviation. Art rushed to attack Reynolds, and they began their duel, exchanging blows as they countered each other's attacks. Together, they launched a massive blast that could be seen by people far from them. Reynolds leapt to attack again, but Art blocked it effortlessly. They continued battling fiercely. Art thought Reynolds was living up to expectations, his punches becoming sharper and leveraging his longer reach to keep Art at bay. Dodging one of Reynolds' punches, Art countered with a punch to the bottom of Reynolds' face, stunning everyone watching. Reynolds retaliated with a kick, and then he laughed, acknowledging the new tricks Art had learned. He hugged Art warmly. Art thought about his lightning ability, his most successful deviation, but knew he still had a long way to go. His use of it was unstable, and he hadn't even unlocked the sound or gravity deviations yet. Still, it felt good to impress his parents. Reynolds inquired when Art had learned that, how and what else he knew. Art replied that it hadn't been long ago, and he could barely control it, adding that he couldn't do much else with it yet. Eleanor ran towards Reynolds, asking if he was okay. Alice followed Eleanor, cautioning her to be careful. Vin was so shocked that he asked for something to drink. Tabby commented that Art was truly an extraordinary child. A waiter came to extinguish the grass fire made by Reynolds. Vin and his family left the scene. Hi guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content. They all sat together to have a meal, and there Vin asked Reynolds if he knew what the future of Art would be. Reynolds agreed and mentioned that he knew since Art awakened when he was 3 years old. Tabby was shocked to learn that Art awakened at the age of 3. Alice added that Art also blew up most of their house in the process. Reynolds reminisced about those being the good times. Just then, Eleanor tried to reassure Reynolds by asking if he was fine. After calming down, Vin suggested enrolling Art at the Cyrus Academy. Reynolds questioned if Vin was serious, noting that Art was only 8 years old and the Cyrus Academy was the most prestigious magic institution on the continent. Tabby expressed doubt, but Vin made a compelling point, highlighting the level of skill Art possessed. This made sponsoring Art seem worthwhile, relieving Reynolds of concerns about the expenses. Alice disagreed, mentioning that they couldn't allow it as Vin's family had already done a lot for them. She felt it would be awkward, especially considering Art's young age, and she doubted the academy would even consider him. Vin replied that he had a long-standing business relationship with the game's director of the Osiris Academy herself, and he could talk to her about it. Art excused himself, stating that if it was about his future, he had something to say. After all the discussion, night fell, and they all departed from the dining area, leaving the servants to clean the table. Eleanor retired to her bed, while Art stayed behind to converse with his parents. Reynolds expressed that no matter how much Art changed, he would always be his son. Art remarked that he had indeed changed a lot since they last saw him. Alice commented that she still couldn't believe he had returned to them, now grown into a handsome young man. Reynolds mentioned that even after discovering Art was a deviant mage, capable of perhaps becoming one of the strongest mages in the future, it was still only the second best news of the day. Alice concurred, adding that he was probably too grown up now for his old mother to give him a goodnight kiss. Nevertheless, he gave her a cheek kiss before retiring to his bed. Reynolds advised them to let him sleep. Art bid them both good night, expressing how much he missed them. As they were leaving, Alice suggested to Art that they should go shopping with Eleanor the next day. Art needed some new clothes, and it would be a great opportunity for him to bond with Eleanor. He agreed, and then Reynolds took a moment to thank Vin for his earlier enthusiasm, acknowledging that he meant well. Art then reminded everyone of their earlier conversation, mentioning that he had just reunited with his family, so he wanted to spend some time with them before deciding whether to leave them again to attend the academy or not. Vin agreed, admitting that he might have been getting ahead of himself. As Art stood up, he noted that he seemed more tired from the sparring session than he thought and asked to be excused. He left the room, and Lilia followed him, suggesting that if he went that way, he would end up in their cellars. She proposed a better place, leading him to where the servants of the house were sitting. She informed them that she had a guest with her and hoped they wouldn't mind. Art apologized for any inconvenience he might have caused. An old lady among the servants remarked that Art was the lad who had burned half of the lawn she worked so hard to maintain. Another man assured Art not to mind her, saying the lady was only teasing him. As they both sat there, Art thought that Lilia seemed unusually quiet, but he assumed that was her usual demeanor. Lilia then asked if they had any leftover duck meat, particularly the fatty parts. The old lady served her and remarked that Helstia had been getting suspicious because Lilia had been gaining weight recently. Lilia retorted that she didn't want to hear such comments from her. Another waitress chimed in, telling Art that Lilia always sneaked there whenever she felt stressed. Art wondered what could be stressing her out. The man explained that Vin and Tabi's greatest wish was for their daughter to awaken as a mage, despite neither of them being mages themselves. Lilia also harbored the desire to become a mage, adding a lot of pressure on a young girl like her. Art tried to reassure everyone, telling Reynolds not to worry and mentioning that Helstia's family were nice people who meant well. With that, Alice and Reynolds bid them goodnight and left. The next morning, Art was awakened by Sylvie, and he remarked to her that she seemed excited. He then wondered how Tesia was doing. However, he noticed an odd smell emanating from Sylvie and joked that it seemed he wasn't the only one taking a shower that day. He proceeded to wash Sylvie, and afterward she rested. Just as Art settled in, there was a knock on the door, and upon opening it, he found Eleanor standing there. She greeted him and mentioned that their mother had asked her to wake him up. Art agreed, suggesting they head down to see their mother. Eleanor replied that they would eat breakfast first and then go shopping, prompting them to hurry along. After a brisk run, they reached the market, and Art remarked that it was Xyrus City. His attention was caught by a shop filled with luxurious items, prompting him to wonder what it was. Tabi explained that those small orbs were known as beast cores, magical cores extracted from mana beasts to harness their power. She noted that the effects varied greatly between the cores. A boy could gamble to spend hundreds of gold, but if they were lucky, one might even contain the will of a beast. Art was shocked to hear the mention of hundreds of gold. Tabi clarified that it could be thousands as well. Art thought he was good with his best will. Tabi mentioned that their Helstia auction house had received a bid for those cores and even infant mana beasts, inviting him to take a closer look when he had the chance. He expressed appreciation and thanked her for the offer. Lilia then took him to a place she had in mind as soon as she saw him. They arrived at a barber shop, where Art sat down, staring apprehensively at himself in the mirror, while the barber stood with the scissors. Art seemed scared and asked if it was necessary. Alice replied that Art's hair was atrocious. The barber assured him not to worry, promising to make Art shine like the flawless gem he was. As the cutting began, Art commented that he felt ridiculous. Alice remarked that now he looked perfect, and Eleanor added that he looked good enough to be her brother. They stepped outside, and Alice remarked that Eleanor was correct. Now Art looked like a civilized man. As Art and Lilia wandered, they encountered some differently dressed people. Lilia explained that they were students of the Cyrus Academy. Art admitted he didn't really know much about it. Lilia added that it was a status symbol to be able to wear the uniform, but Art commented that they looked like heels to him. She mentioned that many of them were almost considered royalty around there though. Alice, Tabi and Eleanor joined them, and Alice asked what they were talking about. Lilia replied that they were discussing the school. Then she noticed Art, behaving like a kid, rolling around, and commented that he was like a puppy. Alice noted that Art was usually so calm and mature, finding it refreshing to see him so excited like that. Tabi added that it was a bit comforting for her to see him acting more like a kid, especially after the spectacle of the previous night. Art entered a weapon shop and was immediately captivated by the array of weapons and armor on display. Excitedly taking it all in, a man approached and asked if he needed help, noting that the shop wasn't meant for kids and suggesting he leave politely. Another man pointed out that the shining sword Art was admiring was a dangerous weapon, questioning if he understood its significance, unlike the toy sword he might have at home. Outside, there was a candy stone. As Art turned to leave, he apologized for unintentionally causing any trouble. The man asked him to wait, commenting on his rudeness, then placed his hand on Art's shoulder to stop him. Art requested that he remove his hand. The man seemed indignant, but then noticed Tabi and the others approaching. Tabi, recognizing the situation, confronted the man, informing him that Art was from the branch family of House Ravenpaw. She asked if he would like her to revoke him and his family's participation in the Helstia auction house. Startled, the man, named Augustus, immediately apologized, expressing his ignorance of Art's identity. After they left the shop, Art thanked Tabi for helping him out of the situation. She replied that she was more concerned about the man's reaction than Art's actions. Alice chuckled at that as well. Later that evening, they all returned home. Vin mentioned that they had finally arrived and asked Art to come over, mentioning that there was someone he would like Art to meet. A lady then spoke up, stating that Art must be the one they had been talking about, and Vin proceeded to introduce her as Cynthia, the founder and director of the Osiris Academy. The Osiris Academy was hailed as the most exalted sanctuary for any would-be mage privileged enough to possess both the background and talent to enter. It served as a breeding ground for acclaimed scholars, guild members, leaders, royal guards, and military powerhouses. The fame and prestige associated with the academy were unmatched compared to the countless other academies scattered across the continent. At the helm of it all was the academy's very own director, Goodsky. Art and Cynthia only stared at each other. She extended her hand towards him, stating that it was nice to finally meet him. Art pondered the proper social convention in such a situation, wondering whether he should kiss her hand or shake it. Opting for a handshake, he replied that it was nice to meet her as well. Just then, Alice knelt beside him and apologized for Art's rude behavior, explaining that he had returned home shortly and was unfamiliar with the formal customs of the academy. Art hoped that their meeting wouldn't take long, as he hadn't eaten in hours. Cynthia replied that it was quite all right, and she was the one intruding at such a late hour, but she couldn't refuse a favor from Vin, especially considering his great contributions to the Osiris Academy. Art responded that he was only helping out the academy because he hoped for Lilia to attend one day. Cynthia remarked that it wasn't often she took a house trip to visit a potential student, but Vin piqued her interest when he insisted that a prodigy of the highest caliber was currently living in his home. Then, Cynthia asked Tabi to let them into the open space so that she could see a demonstration. Tabi agreed, but Art urged Alice to at least let him eat dinner first. Tabi asked Cynthia to follow them. Vin mentioned that they had a wonderful paved country yard that would be suitable for the demonstration. Both Art and Sylvie were hungry, and Art remarked that it seemed like they wouldn't be eating dinner soon. When Cynthia saw Sylvie, she commented on how cute she was and asked if she was Reynolds' contracted beast. Art corrected her, explaining that Sylvie was his body and had hatched only a few months ago. Cynthia found it interesting, mentioning that many there purchased manor beasts to form contracts, but she had never seen any like Sylvie. Art explained that Sylvie's mother was some sort of scaled wolf with small wings, and she was almost dead, protecting her egg when Art stumbled into her nest. He considered himself lucky to have found her. Hi guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the content.